Hello guys, welcome, and this would be the continuation of the previous video. So here I would be talking about the macroeconomic aims of the government. So each government in the world has certain objectives that they would want to achieve. It is to fight unemployment, fight inflation, which means they want to create price stability in the country. They would want to have income equality among the people. We will be explaining all these macroeconomic aims in just a second. So also what the governments would want to achieve, they would want to achieve something called economic growth. So this would be related to GDP, and this would be one full chapter explaining what is GDP and how can a government achieve economic growth. Also, achieving full employment or low inflation, or you could tell me fighting unemployment and fighting inflation or achieving price stability, it is the same thing. Okay, so as you can see, when I'm talking about low inflation, it is stable prices. And finally, it is the balance of payments and the redistribution of income. Now, you need to know something very important. Whenever the government tries to achieve something really good, unfortunately, it leads to another problem. So you will see when the government is trying to achieve full employment, unfortunately, it would lead to inflation later on. So whenever a government is trying to adopt a new method to fight unemployment or to fight inflation, we would be calling that policies. So first of all, when I am talking about microeconomics and macroeconomics, this we took it in Unit 2. Micro, it is mainly, I'm talking about the market behaviors of individual consumers and producers. So remember, when I am talking about the micro, it's small, and macro, it is big. Macroeconomics, it is the government. Okay, so mainly I am talking about national economy, different markets of goods and services, the labor, money, the foreign exchange, all of these are macroeconomics. So I want you to think of it as one big market made from something called, not individual demand and individual supply here, I would be talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is the total demand of all goods and services, and aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services. So the term aggregate, it means total. Aims of government policies. What does the government want to achieve? We already explained them, and I need you to keep in mind, there are so many other objectives. However, these are the main objectives that all governments in the world would want to achieve. And as you notice later on, each of these objectives would be one video explained clearly. So right now, we are just introducing a macroeconomics. When I want to talk about full employment, I need you to think about workers. So every government aims at achieving full employment, which means they have something called the labor force, which means we have something called economically active, which are the people willing and able to work, so the people that are having a job, and economically inactive, they are the children, students, housewives, and the physically disabled. So mainly the economically inactive, they are the ones relying on these people that are working. So they are the dependent population. They depend on others in order to get income. So people who are able to work and are willing to work but do not have a job, these are the people that I consider them to be unemployed. Please keep in mind, right now, if I decide to quit my job, and I just decide to be a regular housewife and I don't want to work at all, I cannot be considered as unemployed because I am the one that took that decision. However, if I lose my job for any reason, and I am really, really trying so hard to find another job, but I am not capable to find a job, then I would be considered to be unemployed. So when I'm talking about unemployment rate, you don't need to worry about it right now, but this is how we calculate it. We will explain it in the employment chapter, okay? And I need you to keep in mind, even if the country is achieving something called full employment, there is about 3% that are unemployed, which is only a few people would be changing jobs sometimes. So I leave my current job right now in order to find a better one. So this is something good because I know I wouldn't have left my job if I didn't know that I would be finding a better one that would pay me much more, for instance. The second objective, macroeconomic objective, is the price stability. So why do governments aim to have stable prices? Because when they have stable prices and the prices are not suddenly increasing and we are facing inflation, this would maintain something called economic stability. Okay? And our product would be internationally competitive. So I can compete with other countries. I can export more because I'm not considered to be expensive. Governments usually aim for 2% increase in prices, which is inflation. Why? Because the higher the prices, the higher the profits and the incentives for firms, and thus the firm would be improving the quality of their product. It is impossible to achieve a 0% inflation. So zero, I cannot achieve it because I want you to think of something. When people have money, what will they do? They will continue buying products, right? When we buy more goods and services, what do the firms do in return? They would increase the price. So this increase in price, it's not that bad if it's only about 2%. But if some countries, they face 1,000% increase in prices, and this is hyperinflation. It's crazy inflation. And it would affect the people a lot because their purchasing power would decrease. Why would the government want to achieve economic growth? Because economic growth is a sustained expansion of production possibilities over time. Remember in Unit 1 when we took the production possibility curve and we were talking about two different goods. It could be tables or it could be chairs, remember? And this was my production possibility curve. If I was to achieve economic growth, it means my whole PPC would be shifting to the right. So I'm talking about the green curve here. So we have more resources, better quality of resources. So our whole production would increase. I could be producing both tables and chairs at a more quantity. So it happens due to an increase, I need you to remember, in the quality and the quantity of my factors of production. Okay? Remember this? So economic growth, it could be measured by aggregate demand and aggregate supply. What is my aggregate demand? I explained it before and I told you I want you to think of it as being total demand. Aggregate demand takes into consideration 5 important things. The level of consumption, so I denoted by the letter C. The investment, and I would be denoting it by the I. And the government expenditure, which is the spending patterns, how much the government is spending, and I would denote it by G. And this one, the X minus M, is the balance of trade. So I would be doing exports minus imports. If my exports are greater than the imports, then I would call that a trade surplus. However, if it was less than my imports, I would call it a trade deficit. When I'm talking about aggregate supply, it is the total output of all the producers in the economy. So again, as we took in Unit 2, the demand is always downward sloping. Here, look, the aggregate demand is always downward sloping, and the aggregate supply, which is the producer's point of view, and I'm talking about the total number of producers in a country, it would be upward sloping. Government aims to have sustained and steady economic growth. Why? Because when we have a sustained and stable economic growth, it means the standard of living will improve in the country. So citizens will have a better life, they would live longer because of the good health care that is provided, they would have the proper housing that the government is providing, and so on. When I'm talking about the balance of payments, as we said before, I am talking about exports and imports. So when the government is exporting, it is receiving money. And when it is importing, it means it's buying from other countries. So we're dealing with money. We're dealing with payments and revenues. The government, all governments in the world, they need to record that data. And as we said before, if imports are greater, this is a loss for the government, and if the exports are greater, this is a profit for the government. However, the government would try to achieve stability when I'm talking about the balance of payments. They don't want to have not a surplus nor a deficit, because this would have negative impact on the government that we would explain in more details in later on chapters. When I'm talking about the redistribution of income, governments would want to, so this is the fifth macroeconomic aim, the governments would want to achieve equality in income distribution. So what they usually do, how would they redistribute the income? By taxing. Usually they would use something called progressive taxing, which means they will charge the rich people that get a high income a higher percentage of tax, and usually the people that get a low income, what they will be doing, they might be exempted from paying a tax. So in other words, the rich would have to pay more tax than the poor, and this money can be spent on the poor for housing, education, unemployment, and other benefits. The government does not aim for equal distribution of wealth, because very high taxes for the rich, it is a disincentive to the business. Because if I was making a lot of money and I would tell you I would have to pay a lot of my money as taxes to the government, then I tell you this is unfair. And unfortunately, this would lead to something called tax evasion, where the producers or even the consumers would avoid paying taxes, and this is something illegal. And high benefits for a poor is also a disincentive to effort and work. Why? Because if I know if I'm without a job or I'm getting a low income, I wouldn't want to work harder in order to get a higher salary, because I know that the government always has my back. The government would always pay me money. So right now, let's talk about the macroeconomy as a whole. As we said before, it consists of aggregate demand and of aggregate supply. We already explained what aggregate demand is, and aggregate supply is the total supply of goods and services provided in an economy. Now, this is called the circular flow model, and I want you to think of it as whatever the consumers pay in an indirect way, he's getting it back. So for instance, if I'm talking about the consumers, individuals, firms, and government, they are the ones providing the producers with the labor force, with the factors of production, so whether they have a piece of land that they want to rent it out to the producer. And in return, I want you to think of it as they will be paying, these producers, they will be paying my consumers with money, right? So, which we studied it in Unit 1, we call it factor of production rewards. All right, so they're the ones paying rewards. Consumers are supplying producers with the factors of production. In return, the producers will provide them with the reward. However, when we are providing them with our knowledge as workers, what are we doing? We are producing goods and services. And these goods and services, who would buy it? It would be the consumer. All right, so in return, the consumers, in order to buy these goods and services, they are spending money, as you can see. So we call that total expenditure. Who was getting the money? The producers. And this would generate the national income of the country, since they would be paying the owners of the factors of production. All right, so as a quick summary, workers and owners of land and capital supply their resources to private firms and public organizations in order to produce goods and services. In return, they will be paid an income, and their total income, I would therefore call it my national income. What is GDP? It stands for Gross Domestic Product. Gross Domestic Product. Let us break down this terminology. Gross is total, domestic it is local, and product it's the production, the output. So in other words, whenever I'm talking about GDP, I am talking about the total value of goods and services produced in a macroeconomy during a year. Total output, what does it mean? It's the amount of goods and services available for every person in the economy. How is the GDP paid by? It is paid by the total expenditure of the consumer, so how much we spend. It means this is how much goods and services I am buying. So I am referring back to the definition of the total output. And also it is paid by firms, by the government, and also when we buy goods and services from other countries, which we call it the exports. Macroeconomy is understanding the interaction between what two things? The change in total demand, output, and the national income. And I need to take into consideration the level of employment in the country and the level of inflation. Now, we will briefly explain these macroeconomic objectives, the four main ones, and we would include with them the redistribution of income. So we will explain one at a time. Remember, we would go in more details later on. I would be posting a video about each and every macroeconomic objective, okay, that has a detailed explanation. But for the time being, all you need to know is the government should or tries to achieve low and stable price inflation. In other words, private sector firms, they need to manage their cost of production, and exporters, they sell their products overseas. So I need to export my goods, right? So I want to sell them to other countries. I don't want my goods to be expensive. So here I would be competing internationally. And I want consumers to be able to afford the goods and services that they buy, because when I have inflation, it means the general level of prices in the country has increased. In other words, my purchasing power has become less. So for instance, if I have $100,000, I am capable of buying an apartment. But if inflation occurs, the price of the apartment would not stay $100,000. It would become much more. So my purchasing power, my capability has become much less. What would high inflation do? It would reduce the purchasing power of people's income. It creates hardships for people on low incomes, so they would be struggling in order to find their goods and services at a decent price where they can afford it. The businesses and the firms would have to pay more because everything became more expensive. So when they buy the resources in order to produce their goods and services, they are buying it at a much higher price than before. And it makes goods and services produced in an economy less competitive. Why do we need to achieve high and stable employment? Because the more people are working, the more the output they are generating. So we would have increase in outputs. We would have, since I have a job, I would be having an income, and therefore, because of the income that I am getting, my living standards will become more. And because I am already employed, the demand will increase. So people will start demanding more. In other words, this would affect the economic growth in a country. Why? Because this means when consumers are demanding more, what would the producers or firms do on the other hand? They would start to increase their supply. What would high employment do? Why is it bad? It causes hardship for people who lose their jobs, so they would be struggling in order to buy their needs and wants. They would be spending less on goods and services because they don't have enough money. And when I am unemployed, governments usually, they pay something called welfare payments. It is for the people that are without a job. They are unemployed, they are trying to looking for a job, but they cannot find one. The government would pay them a little amount of money to keep them going. And finally, if I remain unemployed for a long period of time, I would lose my skills. I would forget what I already know. So my productivity as a worker would become much less. Why would governments want to achieve economic growth? Because when firms are producing more, their output is increasing. This means that the firm would be making more revenue and more profits. Now remember, when I as a firm, I am making more profits or revenue, it means I am capable of paying more taxes to the government. Okay, so look at the last one. And then boost output, incomes, jobs, and living standards. They need to carry on with the amount of goods and services they are producing, so they would need to hire more workers. When they hire more workers, they are achieving high employment. Also, it boosts investments by firms in new capital and businesses. So when I figure out that the country is economically growing, this would encourage other investors. So we would have even more growth. Now, why would we want to achieve a stable balance of international payments? So in other words, I don't want to have a surplus or a deficit, because if a country has a deficit on its balance of trade, it means it is importing more than what they are exporting. So the country is paying much more than what they receive in terms of money. So it may run out of foreign currency to buy imports. And the second one is the value of its own currency would depreciate, I would say, or so I would call this depreciation of their own local currency, or a fall against other foreign currencies. And when my currency is depreciating, this would make imports more expensive for us to buy. I want to talk about something called demand side and supply side policies. And as we said before, a policy is a way that the government tries to find solution to the problems that a macroeconomy is facing. So therefore, I would call that macroeconomic management. Excuse me. So when the government is trying to regulate aggregate demand and aggregate supply, they are trying to help and achieve macroeconomic objectives. If they can touch on two things, it's either something called demand side policies or something called supply side policies. Let us start with the first part, the demand side policies. Since I'm talking about demand side policies, it means the government is aiming at achieving an increase in aggregate or total demand in an economy. So they try to influence the level of total demand in an economy using different policy instruments. So they would want to increase total public expenditure. So the government would be spending more on providing goods to the people, because I would have more money left with me as a consumer, and I would be capable of spending more. So this would increase aggregate demand. And also the government is spending more. Okay, it's providing the goods and services for the people. Also, if the government is decreasing the level of taxation in an economy, this would lead to an increase in demand. Let's see why. I, as a consumer, I am paying less taxes. Therefore, I would have more income, more disposable income left with me. More disposable income left with me, I will be spending more. This would increase aggregate demand. Finally, the government could be touching on the rate of interest. So, for example, what they would be doing, they would decrease the interest rate. When the interest rate on borrowing is less, people will be more encouraged to borrow. So when they are borrowing more, it means they will be having more money. And with this more money, what they can do is they will be spending more. Okay, now let's talk about the supply side policies, which is they want to increase aggregate supply in an economy. So it aims to boost the productive potential of an economy. So targeted public expenditures would be, for example, increase in subsidies and increase in research and development in order to increase aggregate supply. When the government is given financial grant or subsidies to firms, the firms will have more money to produce more at a lower cost. So when they are producing more, this is an increase in aggregate supply. Also, the government could be decreasing the tax on corporations or on firms, or the taxes that they pay on profits. Therefore, the firm would be making more profit. When they are making more profit, they have more productive potential, so they will increase the output. And finally, the government could set new regulations and reforms. What do I mean by that? We said before that the government plays a role as a regulator, where they would be setting laws and regulation in an economy. Here, one of the laws would be, for example, outlawing any anti-competitive practices done by large firms. In other words, they are giving more room to smaller firms to enter the market and to compete. And this, when we have more firms, we will have more increase in aggregate supply. So the demand side policy, or what does it do? I'm talking about, as we said before, three things. This is as a quick reminder. We said we are talking about expenditure. We are talking about taxes. And we are talking about the interest rate. So what happens here is disposable income affects aggregate demand, and taxes on profits affect people's incentive to start their own business. Increase in total expenditure to increase aggregate demand would lead to increase in output and would lead to an increase in employment. When the demand side policy is increasing interest rate, consumers save more and borrow less. So what happens at that point? Increase in investments from overseas. And if the interest rate is less, borrowing will become more, and therefore we will increase aggregate demand. Finally, public spending and taxes will redistribute income and wealth. What would the government do here? They will increase the taxes on the rich, as we said before, and probably they will exempt the less fortunate in the country from paying a tax. Therefore, they wouldn't have a big gap between the rich and the poor in the country, and I would say this is called redistribution of income. Right now, we would want to evaluate the possible conflicts when the government is trying to achieve these macroeconomic aims. So, for example, when the government is achieving full employment, unfortunately, this would lead to high inflation. So the government would need to think, what am I supposed to achieve? Is it full employment or I want to achieve inflation? Because both of them do not go together. Let me tell you why. When everyone is employed, so I'm talking about full employment, it means everyone has money. And when we have money, what do? Our spending increases. When our spending increases, what would happen to the prices? The prices rise. Automatically, when I see this is what happened, unfortunately, this is known as inflation. So the government would want to try and achieve both full employment and stable prices, but it's difficult to do so. Also, would the government want to achieve economic growth or a balance of payment stability? Or would the government want to achieve full employment versus a balance of payment stability? So this, I already explained it before. Let me start by explaining the economic growth and full employment versus a balance of payment stability. If a government aims for economic growth, the output will increase, all right? To produce this higher output, firms may need to import more raw materials and component parts from other countries, leading to a deficit in the balance of payments. It will therefore be difficult for a government to achieve a balance of payment stability. Now, when I am talking about economic growth versus full employment, let's see what happens here. If a government aims to achieve full employment, more people will be working, so there is likely to be an increase in income. Higher incomes are likely to lead to higher spending. And some of this may involve buying imports. If that is the case, it will make a deficit in the balance of payments more likely. It will therefore be difficult for a government to achieve balance of payment stability. Okay? Now, do macroeconomic aims always conflict? So when the government is using the demand side policy or the supply side policy, is it always achieving all the objectives at once? You have economists arguing. So let's see how, yes, because the macroeconomic objectives of a government can prove difficult to achieve individually, but especially all at the same time. So these conflicts, yes, they may exist. For example, I want you to think of some policy measures to try and reduce unemployment and boost economic growth may result in higher rates of price inflation. So, for example, a government may increase its spending and cut its taxes to boost the total demand for goods and services in the economy, and this in turn should help to create more jobs and incomes. However, as total demand increases the market prices of many goods and services, it will also tend to rise. I want you to think of this as a discuss question. Okay? Now, if price inflation is high and rising, a government may introduce measures to reduce the total demand. So, for example, it may increase the taxes on incomes. It might decrease government or public expenditures. And it might also raise the interest rate in order to make borrowing more expensive. So people will not borrow money, they will not have enough money in order to buy goods and services. Now, reducing the total demand may help to slow down the rate at which prices are rising, and it may reduce the prices of the goods and services, but firms are likely to respond by cutting or stopping production. So it will not, when they're not producing enough goods and services anymore, what will they do is they will start laying off workers because they always aim at cutting down their costs. So we would be having unemployment. Now let's see why no. However, not all economists accept there will always be conflicts between government macroeconomic aims. That is, they see no reason why low unemployment and low and stable prices, economic growth, and the balance of payment stability cannot be achieved all together. Government economic policies, they argue. And let's see how. If price inflation can be reduced to a low and stable rate, more than employment and faster than economic growth, and we have a favorable balance of trade, all of this can be achieved. So what they would do is rising national income and employment means people will become better off. Thereby, this would help to decrease the poverty. And rising income also means there would be more tax revenues collected by the government from wages and profits, and this will be increasing the government's revenue, and it would be giving a higher welfare payments to the people, and there would be new investments done by the government, so more public spending. Okay, and this would benefit the economy, and therefore it would lead to growth. Reducing inflation will help make domestically produced goods and services more competitive. As a result, demand for them will tend to rise at home and in overseas markets. So our balance of trade would be more favorable. Okay, and what will firms do in return? Because they are exporting more of their goods and people are demanding more of their goods, they would hire more people and therefore they would be achieving employment. So as you can see, we can look at this in two different sides, but you always need to make sure you are defending what you are writing or talking about. That was it for today. Thank you so much and have a lovely day. Goodbye.